Accetta.
We welcome to the stage Federico Luciani, who today will be talking about From the Land of Mari, interactions between tribes and states in the second millennium Mesopotamia. Welcome, Federico.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Armando, Alexander, and the audience for joining in. Thank you, Armando, for the presentation. I will share my screen now. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So, before I start my presentation, I would like to say a word or two about where I come from and the context of Near East teaching and research in my country. As Armando said, I am from Argentina. Here's a little basic geography. I don't know why it's not changed here. A little basic geography. I live in Rosario, a city by the Paraná River, one of the most important rivers in the country and the continent. Together with the river Uruguay, they make up the Argentinian Mesopotamian region, which is in no way like the ancient Mesopotamian region. I'm a professor in Rosario National University and Litoral National University. In both institutions, I teach ancient Near East history. In my country, if you want to become an ancient Near East historian, you must go first through a 4 to 5 years degree in general history, which is more or less a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And in these degrees, there is always a course on ancient Near East history, in many cases in the first year. That's what I teach. After you have completed this general degree, you can choose to specialize in a period or a topic for postgraduate studies and thesis. It is not a surprise that ancient Mesopotamia is not a very popular choice, with most scholars studying Argentinian or Latin American history. This said, there is hopefully a growing number of scholars specializing and doing research in the ancient Near East for at least 2 generations. There are also a number of journals dealing with ancient Near East history and culture. And as Armando was saying just a minute ago, in this case, I would like to mention Claroscuro. It's a journal from Rosario University, published twice a year, in which I participate as co-editor. I invite you to access the website before you start your weekend and browse the different issues. I also encourage you to submit a paper for the next issue. After this personal and institutional background, I would like to talk about some of the topics I studied for my dissertation. In broad terms, it deals with control of population and territory in the Kingdom of Mari during the reign of Zimri-Lim and the interaction between tribes, states, and ethnicity. My research focused on the text from Mari Palace in the Old Babylonian period. So first, I would like to say a few words about this. The ancient city of Mari is in nowadays Syria, on the banks of the Euphrates River. It is known as Tell Hariri. It was accidentally discovered in 1933, and the archaeological excavations began later that year, in December. The first archaeologist sent by the French government was André Parot, who stayed in charge of the site for at least 4 decades. Then followed Jean-Claude Margueron and Pascal Butelin. The occupation of the site dates back to the mid-3rd millennium. One of the most important findings was the gigantic palace, of which we can see some images here on the screen, and the famous Louvre maquette. But Mari is also famous for its archives. One of the largest archives in the Near East was found on the site, with thousands of texts written in Akkadian, letters, administrative records, law documents, and inscriptions. Despite the amount, the time span for most of these documents is very short, just half a century, between the late 19th century to mid-18th century BC. Studying Mari texts has an advantage. From the beginning, they are the result of regular excavation carried out by archaeologists, epigraphists, and philologists, whose result and fieldwork were published with some continuity in careful archaeological reports. This meant that the publication was undertaken initially in one single series, the famous Archives Royales de Mari, which counts so far more than 30 volumes, the first of which came out in 1950. Years later, other ways of publication were added. For example, the volume of the series Littérature ancienne du Proche-Orient, edited by Durand, and the monographic volumes of Florilegium Marianum. Also, the 8 issues of Mari Journal. In English, we can mention the 12th volume of Mesopotamian Civilizations by Wolfgang Heimpel, and the anthology compiled by Jack Sasson in 2015. To sum up, many of Mari's texts have been available in transliteration and translation for more than 50 years, so they can be studied from all over the world. But from 2008 on, we have the possibility to browse Old Babylonian archival texts in the Archibab database. This project, directed by Dominique Charpin, is growing every year with texts and bibliography. It hosts thousands of Mari texts, many of them with transcription and translations, and even photographs. This database allows the cross-search of names, dates, type of text, place of discovery, subject, specific words. In addition, each document entry is accompanied by bibliographical recommendations or other translations. This database became a fundamental tool in my research. In this presentation, I will be dealing only with the final phase of the archive, and Mari history. By the Old Babylonian period, we have this sequence of rulers. We have the so-called Lim dynasty, whose reign was interrupted by Samsiadu of Ekalatum. After 17 years, the capital city was reconquered by Zimri-Lim, who reigned there for 13 years, until Hammurabi of Babylon invaded the city and burned it to the ground 2 years later. Since Zimri-Lim arrived at Mari after several years of absence, I thought it suitable to study the way in which he takes advantage of certain forms of control of the population and territory while continuing to maintain his tribal leadership. So the main question is, what strategies were put into play or overlapped to control and administer a territory? What was the interplay between tribe, state, and ethnicity? To do that, it is necessary to incorporate a 3-dimension analysis: the interaction of different political logics, the means of subsistence, and ethnic identity or ethnicity. Crossing these 3 aspects is key to understand Mari politics. the control of territory and population. Regarding the first dimension, the idea was not to work exclusively on the more traditional nomad sedentary opposition, because this does not fit well with the realities of the Middle Euphrates, and because Mari's documents do not show such a confrontation. Nomadism and sedentaries, in any case, are considered means of subsistence, employing different strategies, but not opposed to each other. In particular, I use the term pastoral nomadism to define a way of life that implies the exploitation of herds of small livestock linked to a nomadic strategy. I have benefited from Anne Porter's ideas. She considers that shepherds and farmers are in fact part of the same social and political fabric that occasionally practice different forms of subsistence. This division did not mean the existence of two different population layers or the separation between ethnicities, but it is used instead to identify a spatial division of labor, which in turn require specific control mechanism by the authorities. The second dimension refers to the forms of political organization, the logics of political configuration. These are considered as a code, a language. This approach allows one or more logics to coexist. In this case, we have considered the coexistence of two political logics, the state logic and the tribal logic. Both concepts have a rather thick history, so to speak, so they were thought as a guideline to read the text. With respect to state logic, we characterize it based on the consolidation of dominant relationships, invisible institutions, such as the palace, that sanction inequality. We add the capacity to exercise violence, the creation of an army used both in war with other states and for internal purposes. It is defined by the capacity to utilize the productive surplus and the capacity to modify the landscapes and human ties through administration and bureaucracy. In this sense, the state logics revolves around the royal persona, whose presence in the documentation is overwhelming. On the other hand, the tribal logic. In my case, I consider it a particular way of expressing political ties, which is not necessarily tied to a particular means of subsistence. Kinship may play a certain role in characterizing this dynamic, but tribal logic is presented as an alternative form of identification of both cities and territories, and it has also a broader spatial scope. I have benefited from Daniel Fleming's ideas here. Tribes recognize the existence of leaders. In the Yaminite case, there are up to 5 with the name of king. In addition, we identify tribal logic as a space that allows a greater room for negotiation, dialogue, and consultation. Finally, the third dimension corresponds to ethnic identity. Here, some contribution helped me to think of ethnic group not as data in a list, but by thinking about how they define themselves and how this determines the interactions. Ethnicity is considered relational and even transitive in nature. I want to mention the contribution of Cristina Di Bernardi, who was one of my teachers and tutors here in Argentina, in her understanding of ethnicity as a relational quality that acquires consistency in relation to others, and that is, in this relationship, identity characteristics are reinforced. Thus, ethnic groups can define themselves on the basis of their enunciation and the bonds they established. Ethnicity can stand out or can be hidden. What is certain is that it can be used as political capital with the capacity to be activated at precise moments. So the main ethnic identities present in Mari letters are the Sim'alites and the Yaminites. They both have members living in towns and cities along the Euphrates and participated in the tribal and state logic. They were defined to each other, sons of the right and sons of the left. There are some letters that show them as two different entities, even fighting. But on some occasions, Sim'alites and Yaminites conduct together against some foreign enemy, like the Elamites. Regarding their political status, the Yaminites were one big ethnic group, but were split into 5 tribes, each one with a king. In contrast, the Sim'alites acted as a single tribe with one leader, which was also the king of Mari, Zimri-Lim. Another important feature about this is that by the end of the second millennium, the Yaminites had been defeated by King Zimri-Lim and had to swear obedience to him. I will look back to this later. After this historical and theoretical framework, I would like to comment some issues related to control of space and territory and the interactions between tribe, state, and ethnicity. I should mention the political character of ethnicity, and especially the Sim'alite ethnic group. That is why I would like to go deeper into this, paying special attention to the way in which the king, Zimri-Lim, presented himself and how he identified in his titles. I will change here. If we look at different royal inscriptions and other texts where the king is mentioned, we can see the quite traditional titles and descriptions. His relationship with the gods, especially Dagon, his manly characteristics, his deeds as a great builder, who his father was. But it is also important to consider the geographical aspect of the title, especially when we read King of Mari and the Land of Hannah, a title that had already been used by his alleged father, Yakhnu-Lim, but not Samsi-Adu. So what does Mari and the Land of the Hannah refer to and why it is important? Mari was used to identify the territory organized along the Euphrates River and the Habur, the core of which were 3 administrative districts called the Ahpuratin. This territory and its organization were actually an inheritance from the previous king Samsi-Adu, and Zimri-Lim did not make too many changes in its administrative structure, but rather took advantage of it, or tried to do it. In any case, Zimri-Lim had to make his tribal leadership coexist with the long-standing city traditions coming from urban centers, like the palace, the bureaucracy. But the second part, the Land of the Hannah, is not present in the royal titles of Samsi-Adu. We have here a combination of the term Matun, which is generally translated as country or land, a political entity or a polity, and the term Hannah. There has been some debate about the translation of this term until several years ago. Durand linked its etymology to a pastoral nomadic way of life. So Hannah is a way of naming those who seasonally roam the Syrian steppe with their herds. It is important to note that the term does not necessarily imply ethnic identification, but rather a means of subsistence. In consequence, we have a few texts dealing with Yaminite Hannah. But it is interesting to note that by the reign of Zimri-Lim, the Sim'alite tribe had assumed a leading role in the kingdom of Mari and the Middle Euphrates. So many of the references to Hannah are a shortcut to mobile Sim'alites, as Fleming says. Then when Zimri-Lim is named King of the Land of the Hannah, is referring to a human group that moves through the territory of the Ahpuratin, but could also be found in other kingdoms away from the capital city. The physical distance did not vanish the political ties that bounded this itinerant Sim'alite and the leader of his tribe, who were also united by the membership of a large ethnic group. The land of the Hana was then a socio-political entity that allowed to define and organize the relation between individuals, emphasizing the tribal logic rather than the state logic. I would like to speak now about two different strategies set up by Zimri-Lim in what has been called the hybrid administration, which would show how the tribal and state logic interacted. In the first place, the control of the banks of the Euphrates consisted of 3 districts, Haltsum in Akkadian. In each of them, there were numerous towns and villages, inhabited either by Sim'alites or Yaminites. In several documents, these 3 districts are considered a single unit. Unlike the Matum, the Haltsum has no political identity of its own, its authorities being appointed from the capital. Its definition is strictly territorial. The delimitation and modification of the landscape appears as the capacity for intervention that is proper to state logic, creating a new space for administration and control. These districts were in charge of an office called Shapitum. These so-called governors wrote letters all the time to Zimri-Lim, and in fact the bulk of correspondence deals with this matter. The main task of this office was to put into production the lands belonging to the palace or to collect taxes on the fields of private individuals. Additionally, they oversaw the census that recorded the individuals available for military or work duties. In year 5 of Zimri-Lim, there was a census that provided the name to the next regnal year. Finally, a third function had to do with the use of violence. Each governor had at his disposal a military unit which patrolled the Ahpuratim and whose main task was the tracking of fugitives. But despite this description of what appeared to be the functions, what stands out when reading the letters are the limits of the capacities of the state logic. It appeared that these governors were quite inefficient in the performance of their duties. The second part of this hybrid administration centered on the king, who had to have control of a mobile population group which could cross the borders of sedentary states. As a geographical context, the reduced space for agriculture around the Middle Euphrates benefited the expansion of small livestock breeding, linked to a nomadic strategy, as said. The human groups engaged in this strategy were more like the rule than the exception. This mobile population was connected to Zimri-Lim through the tribal logic, so they were outside the administrative hierarchy described above. It was even a problem when the mobile Sim'alites entered the district because the governors could not command these people. There are 2 terms that can grasp their relationship with territory. The first one is nigum, which has a few attestations. It denominates the grazing places whose access was regulated through pacts and alliances. Sim'alites and Yaminite had different nigums, which could be found within the limits of states. This allows us to understand the non-contiguous territorial aspect of the land of the Hana mentioned a moment ago. This way of relating to and appropriating the territory is typical of the pastoralist way of life that requires constant mobility and the crossing of borders. At the same time, the tribe functions as a form of political configuration as it allows transcending distance and spatial limits. The second term related to the appropriation of territory by mobile population is nagum, which may indicate the steppe, the groups that traverse it, or the herds that accompany them. In this non-contiguous space, the central figure was the merhum, the chief of pasture, a very important office key to Zimri-Lim. We know that merhum were present both in Yaminite tribes and in the Sim'alite tribes, but the bulk of mentions correspond to the latter. The Mehun belonged to the tribal sphere, so the issues that were resolved within each Yaminite tribe may not have been recorded in Mari's archives. That's why we know so little about them. Sometimes the function of the Mehun were seen as the voice of the nomads vis-a-vis the sedentary state. But their functions were more complex than mere speakers. They were key players in Zimri-Lim's arrival at the city of Mari, and they continued to practice an important role in the conduct of international relationships. One of them, Banum his name, in activity during the first years of Zimri-Lim, had a seal with the inscription, "The one who restored Yahdun-Lim descendants." Even another Mehun with the name of Ahmad found his way into the epic of Zimri-Lim, of which there is a recent English translation in the Orak database. This Mehun, Ahmad, is, besides the kings and the gods, the only character with a personal name in the composition. The Mehun was outside any palace center hierarchy, so the letters they sent to Zimri-Lim have a different tone or mood, another type of phrasing. They feel closer. While the letters from the governors are merely polite reports denoting submissions, the letters sent by the Mehun give orders and advice to Zimri-Lim. There is a wider margin for consultation. Moreover, the mobile character of the Mehun repeatedly brought them into the space controlled by the Shapington of the Halsum, who hastened to write Zimri-Lim about the presence of a population group they could not control or command. This situation should not be analyzed under the classic confrontation between nomads and sedentary people. Rather, they are the critical and conflicted points that allow us to study the particular interaction of political logics in Mari society, with certain authorities in charge of the settled population and others who were in charge of the mobile element, although the coexistence became complicated. In these situations, the interactions between state and tribal logic could generate problems and tip the balance toward the latter. Finally, I would like to talk about the Yaminites. As mentioned earlier, the Yaminites were one of the most important ethnic groups in the Middle Euphrates region. Their identification was related to the existence of the other major ethnic group, the Sim'alites. From the political point of view, the Yaminites were divided into 5 tribes, but occasionally they could behave as one group. It is important to mention that at the beginning of Zimri-Lim's reign, both ethnic groups maintained good relations, expressed, for example, in inter-ethnic marriages to seal alliances. For example, Zimri-Lim's sister was married to the leader of the Yaminite tribe, But after a few years, relations were destabilized, since the Sim'alites were reluctant to accept equality with the Yaminites, even denying that they could be called their brothers. This is why, at the beginning of the reign, the Yaminites revolted against Zimri-Lim. There is a set of letters that allow us to follow the development of this conflict and to read the voices of both Sim'alites and Yaminites. The conflict acquired inter-ethnic character, but was also connected to alliances with other states. The Yaminites allied with the enemy of Mari at the moment, the city of Eshnuna. Despite the division into 5 independent tribes, the ethnic component was activated, a temporary union strengthened by ethnic ties. Zimri-Lim in exchange received support from Babylon and Yamhad and was able to crush the revolt. The next regnal year was nominated after this event, year in which Zimri-Lim achieved a victory over the Yaminites. The following year, the same problems arose again, with the same result. The Yaminites were defeated for a second time. But on this occasion, most of the Yaminite kings disappeared and were replaced by a new generation who had to accept the authority of Zimri-Lim as leader of the Banks-of-Euphrates. We can observe this by reading the letter they wrote to Zimri-Lim, where they define themselves as son or servant of the king and constantly express the desire to establish alliances and peace. On this matter, peace was established, but in an unbalanced way. In some of these letters, the Yaminite kings wished their lands on the bank of the Euphrates to be returned to them. But as the political situation had changed, Zimri-Lim could or could not grant this request. In turn, he had to deal with the district governors who were quite surprised at this. So they wrote to their king asking what they should do and the problem that this policy would cause. Regarding this situation, Zimri-Lim chose to pacify the domestic front. One last question. In the documents written by the Yaminite leaders, we can also read conflicts between the tribes themselves, with the kings accusing each other or commenting what they do and the others don't. Therefore, after a moment of transitory alliance, where a common ethnic identity was manifested, intra-ethnic and intertribal conflicts reappeared. I will go now to some final thoughts. The aim of this online lecture series is to explore and cross the boundaries between philology and history. Mari texts and the work carried out mainly by the French team allow us to understand how impossible it is to make any outlines of history without philological and research and knowledge of the documents. It's worth mentioning the value of the Mari archives as an inescapable source for the knowledge of the Syrian region, especially for the Old Babylonian period. Also to mention the value of correspondence as a historical source based on a more concrete and human depiction of society. Regarding my topic, some reflections on the question of interactions between tribes, states, and ethnicities. Zimri-Lim emerged as the main leader in the Middle Euphrates. He was able to conquer the city of Mari. But once there, he had to control a territory with different traditions and loyalties, with settlements with population that might not be loyal to him. Hence the hybrid administration, two lines of authority that crossed each other quite a lot. In order to understand this complex reality, it seems pertinent to consider different aspects: subsistence strategies, pastoral nomadism and sedentary agriculture, the political logics of tribe and state. We consider it appropriate for the study of the realities of the Middle Euphrates because excluding one of them can make us lose sight of the complexity of that political world. The concept of tribe, in particular, allows us to grasp in some way the political form that a given subsistence strategy can adopt. An ethnic identity which could cross the previous forms of identification, occupational categories, etc. Thus, during the Zimri-Lim period, a form of ethnic identification and a form of political logic overlapped in the case of the Sim'alite ethnicity with the Sim'alite tribe. The case of the Yaminite was posed differently, with situation of greater or lesser rapprochement between them. Researching into Mari archive to understand the interactions between tribe and state and the forms of control of territory and population allow us to see the limits of the construction of authority in the Middle Euphrates. We can say that this process was ambiguous. Zimri-Lim appealed to previous authorities and political structures, the districts, but he faced many limits and resistance. In the conduct of tribal and ethnic relations, we can appreciate a greater freedom because this constitutes Zimri-Lim's main political support. In this sense, I stress once again the importance of thinking ethnicity as a political capital that can be drawn upon, and this is true for both Sim'alites and Yaminites. Unfortunately, the short duration of Zimri-Lim's reign and the destruction of Mari by Hammurabi prevented us from knowing how effective this strategy could have been. For the last 50 years, the cuneiform texts of Mari have allowed us a better understanding of the history of the ancient Near East. The continuous flow of publication and study forces us to constantly look over what we know. It is hoped that the publication of new texts will allow us to question our knowledge and to make a view of the region even more complex in a productive relation between philology and the broader field of social sciences. Thank you very much.